All right, our next speaker probably has an excuse for feeling fairly stressed. His flight was late and he has driven at breakneck speed to literally arrive through the door right now. So perfect timing. Richard Suhr, who is partner APAC digital lead at EY. Richard's an experienced technology leader, an expert in creating high-growth digital businesses across Asia-Pacific, specialising in the acceleration of sales and marketing outcomes for global businesses in the JPAC region. He's demonstrated expertise in strategy and planning, large-scale transformation design, sales and marketing operations, as well as market development for global operations and organisations. He's a dynamic and innovative leader. Outside of his role as a partner at EY, he's also, importantly, a member of the board of Cricket Wellington and also GeoOp. He's the founder of a technology investment company and advises a number of technology startups. Please welcome, feeling slightly breathless after a frantic run in from the airport, Richard Suhr.
Thank you. Cheers. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I feel horribly underqualified to talk about digital after someone from Pandora's been up here talking, so that was great just to catch the end of it, so whoever Sarah is out there. Thank you. That was quite inspiring to hear that. I wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk to you about the way that we're thinking about digital from the context of the CFO, and in particular in the context of from balance sheet and investment. So I think many of you, I suspect, like me, have spent the last 10 years watching technology change, if not the last 20 or 30 years managing technology cost. And the conversation we tend to be having with most of our CEOs and CFOs right now is actually not a technology discussion. So you won't hear me talk too much today about technology. In fact, I think one of the biggest problems when I talk to folks about digital is that the technology now is changing so fast that it's almost academic. If you put aside some of the massive core investments that you'll make in technology, so if it's core banking, if you're in financial services or claims as an insurance company, or your CRM or your core MRP platforms, if you put those big traditional technology investments aside, what most of you are talking to us about now is saying, how do we keep pace with the constant change, not in the technology, but in the business model? So, and the reason I think it's now a capital agenda is that what's happening very quickly is that companies like Pandora, but a slew of smaller companies are coming to the market in rapid time. So they're coming far faster than they ever have. So the difference for a CFO in terms of managing the executive and the board is that it really is on your watch now. In the past, it was easy to say this disruption, it might take 10 years, it might take 20 years. Who knows whether driverless cars will be on our roads? Driverless cars will be on our roads in the next 3 or 4 years. Driverless cars are on our roads. And now the job of the CFO is to manage how you balance the competing priorities. So when we talk to our biggest global automotive customers, they're not going to throw out the manufacturing plan for today and start wholesale building driverless cars, but they're absolutely concerned and worried about the rapid number of brand new business models that will emerge around that technology trend. And they're also not sure what the right technology is, and we don't have an answer for them. So the challenge now for the CFO is to say, how do I manage investment on both sides of the innovation balance sheet? How do I grow shareholder return and be sensible about the business we have today? So Ford still sells lots of cars that people drive. That channel isn't going away. They have a known digital problem in terms of their market entry into Asia. They know that they can't build enough branches and dealerships overnight to deal with consumer demand. But they also need to now be thinking about, am I appropriately managing the investment and what might be happening next? So we're going to talk you through a little bit of that. And like I say, I prefer not to talk about technology. I'll do a little bit of context around what I think are some of the bigger trends. But I'm sure people come and talk to you every day about technology. So let's talk instead about what it means in terms of the balance sheet. And by the way, those that know me, I know a number of folks in the room, it's very hard to stop me talking, but I wouldn't encourage you just to ask along the way. These sessions are much better if you all tell me what you think. So please feel free to pop up your hand, and I think there's some mics at the back. So let's go through a couple of things. Let's go through why I think this is important to you, in terms of the balance sheet, what it means for your most important stakeholders, so for shareholders, for board, for the rest of the exec. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you all are saying to me in the region. So I'd love to share with you the perspective I get from CFOs when I talk to them about what this means in digital. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how you manage this. So you don't manage it by going out and buying a bunch of new tech. You manage it by treating it like any other risk, any other capital risk in the business, and managing that effectively. Unlike me with my microphone. So I'll see if I can just get that back on. There we go. So, just a couple of points to start, and apologies, I'll just see. Here we go. So I think more than ever we are living in an era where technology disruption is going to mean that people change the business model. And I'll let you read the quote, but the thing that's interesting about all the examples you hear when people come and talk about digital is not the tech. I defy most people to show me an algorithm that is so superior that no one else will be able to replicate it. Or to show me a piece of technology which you won't find there are 100 other copies within the next 5 or 10 years. The genius of most of the really successful, innovative digital firms is that they have thought about a different type of business model, and normally the business model comes from having thought about the user. So this is a really fundamental shift for most CFOs and CEOs. Is over the last 20 or 30 years, we've tended to think about optimizing productivity and cost. You know, the advantage of all of the last wave of Fortune 500 companies was capital and strength in the balance sheet. You know, certain economies could only be achieved if you were very, very large. So, you know, the age of client-server computing, the technology wave that was important to me in the last 20 years, required massive amounts of capital to install it. It required large efficiency of scale in order to get competition across a region or across a global distribution network. Those are the things that are changing now as a result of technology. But if you focus only on the cost side, if you focus only on optimizing productivity and the way you go about delivering your service, then you'll never win. You have to have that balance of thinking about how does this change the experience for the user. So whether it's Pandora, whether it's Uber, you know, whether it's Amazon, what all these amazing companies do is they change and make things easier for the user to do, and then they work backwards to work out how technology can solve that problem. So you will have seen countless technology problems. The reason it's happening is because the technology gets cheaper and cheaper and changes more quickly every day. So roughly, you know, people ask me all the time, what do we mean by digital? It doesn't really matter. To be honest, digital now is all of the pervasive changing technology that is available to your businesses. So whether it's web, mobile, social, whether it's increasingly the Internet of Things, the notion that everything will be connected. So 5 or 10 years ago, we laughed about the fridge being connected, but the reality now is this is an enterprise opportunity. So every single device in your supply chain and your infrastructure will be connected and have data and have metrics that you can use to manage the business. All of us will be connected all of the time. That's the starting assumption. So when I travel through Asia, probably much more so than in New Zealand, if you go to China, for example, people will talk mobile only. And what they mean is there's no point trying to worry about developing and investing heavily into your web presence. Almost everything's happening on the phone. Now, very, very different economies, very different social economies, but the reality is that we'll be there soon as well. The reality is that every consumer will be connected all the time, and your business will be connected. So if you think about large-scale retail businesses, you'll be able to trace and track goods right from origination and through the manufacturing supply chain all the way to the end user. The trick is to think about what that means that's different in the business model. But the real issue, and you'll see we've popped up the bottom there, the real issue is it means that it's a totally different level of investment in product development. And this, I think, is the biggest challenge for a CFO. So our job's not to dream up the next new exciting consumer proposition necessarily. That's absolutely part of your innovation agenda, is to make sure you're at least investing in that. But the real prize is, why would you build a warehouse? Why would you build a distribution waypoint when it's clear that technology will disrupt that model? It's clear that there are large-scale robotic warehouses being built all over the world. So would you go and sign on a workforce to do that over the next 5 or 10 years? Now, the answer is you probably have to. You probably have to because we're probably not quite ready. it's unclear what technology will win. It's unclear whether anyone's delivered it at scale and can replicate it in your particular distribution environment. But would you bank the future of the balance sheet on making large-scale traditional capital investments like that? Not if I'm running the balance sheet. The secret of these agile digital companies is that they put their money to use with the customer at the front end, and then they use technology wherever they can without investing heavily into that in terms of their capital. And interestingly, the capital's coming from other places too. So we'll talk about that in a moment. We've had a number of discussions with government in the last few while saying the nature of the people that will underwrite large-scale infrastructure investment will look really different. The people that underwrite Uber aren't doing it because they just think they're going to get fares from people being driven around in cars. They're doing it because they think that Uber will be the biggest supply chain company in the world. They're doing it because they think they can displace, logistics and carriers, that they can become far more effective in terms of optimizing the network. And so the private equity valuation of every dollar of investment into infrastructure looks totally different to traditional investment into infrastructure. So if you're about to build a highway, whose money do you want? Do you want the money from smart, digital, data-driven investors who'll find 3 or 4 different ways to monetize that data? Or do you want it from bricks and mortars, concrete and pillar? So those are the decisions I think that most of our CEOs and CFOs are talking to us about. Not will Uber win, but what does it do to the balance sheet? What does it do to the model? What does it do to my investment portfolio? I'm going to use a couple of examples, and not because they're, flavor of the day at the moment. So driverless cars, what intrigues me about driverless cars is not whether we'll all be driving around without, having to use the steering wheel. It's what it means to everything else in the supply chain. So some of the really interesting use cases to come out of driverless car is think about what that means in terms of the ability to change the way that goods and freight are delivered. If you think about, in essence, the problem that driverless car is trying to solve is to optimize the network. So it's to reduce traffic congestion and flows, to make delivery more efficient. That was the science which has been built for driverless car, and it was first deployed actually in mining and utilities very successfully. So people say to me, who are the best people to talk to about autonomous vehicles? It's not Google and Facebook, it's Rio and BHP. If you go to one of their mining sites and look at how efficient they are with completely controlled, completely safe autonomous vehicles, that's the future. The reason they did it wasn't because they wanted to start Uber. The reason they did it is because every minute of productivity in their supply chain is millions and millions of dollars of growth, or profit rather. So, not these days, right? Not at $30 a ton. So, there's no one from Rio or BHP. I'll be very careful. We're not being filmed. So I think the issue to think about with driverless car is how the technology disruption around the data, around the infrastructure and the network, how that impacts your business. One of the biggest investors into autonomous vehicles, and in my old role I can talk about that, was Hyundai. Hyundai invested not necessarily because of the business of selling cars, they're as invested in their credit card division. So Hyundai runs the largest credit card facility in Korea. They're interested because they see this as the next way that people will buy. They see that as I'm driving home, I'm going to have a whole lot of choices now. I'm going to have the ability to connect and interact and be online. So there's all sorts of different ways that they can monetize. Most car companies already make far less money out of selling new cars than they do out of the parts and maintenance, as you all know. The vision for most of our global automotive clients is they'll make more money out of commerce with the advent of a connected car and driverless cars. And so those kind of examples around thinking through, if I'm now the provider of goods, if I'm in retail or manufacturing, would I still deploy a logistics model? Or would I look towards starting to trial and say, what would happen if I could connect to the driverless car and know where it was, leave things at your workplace? So the whole click and collect model, which historically was built by logistics companies, so this is all the postal services leaving lockers and boxes for you to put things in. Think about what that model looks like when you have a car that's connected, you know where it will be, where it can be remote locked and unlocked, where trusted providers can deliver goods to it. So that's the model that I guess, now if you were building a logistics network for an online delivery company, you would say, I don't need to invest in vehicle. I certainly don't need to do, what a Visi would have done 15, 20 years ago in Australia. I don't need to invest in a fleet of vehicles. Secondly, I'm probably not going to invest in a traditional logistics provider because their overhead is too high because they invested in vehicles. Thirdly, I'm going to look to whether or not I can use an automotive company or to a virtual ride-sharing company and find the lowest possible cost to get my goods the last mile. Will New Zealand have critical mass to pull it off as quickly? Possibly not. That's always our dilemma in New Zealand because we're late adopters, not because we're not clever or innovative, but because we don't have scale. All of these business models will launch first in markets that have scale. What will then happen, though, for you as CFOs is you'll need to know what's happening so you can work out how quickly to move your capital from the old model to the new. And all that's happening now is the time is getting compressed. So one more example, and you will have seen, I don't know if we have representatives here from Spark. Spark's done some incredible work with the launch of Morepork, which people might be familiar with here in New Zealand, the idea of a connected home. That trend has started 4 or 5 years ago. You've seen some very big acquisitions, $1 billion acquisition by Google of Nest, which is a smoke sensor. Who'd have thought you'd pay $1 billion for a smoke sensor? But the sensor is important because it tells you more and more about what's happening in the house and my behavior. The monetization, again, is not in the device itself. So the monetization is not for Samsung or higher around the fridge. The monetization is think about all the things you're learning about my family's behavior. Think about all the things you're learning about my power consumption, my usage, when I'm at home, when I'm not, when the best time is to help me with my household. So if you're an insurer, if you're a utility provider, this is all data that should help you compete in terms of getting to that consumer and offering a better proposition. Now here's the hard part, and this I think is the number one conversation we're having with boards at the moment. And a quote from Jack Welch is that, once the pace of change becomes greater outside the organization, you need to change or you're going to die. So, I guess Jack's one of the great innovators. This is, I think, is a more interesting metric. I don't know if many of you follow Mary Meeker. If you do one thing in digital, listen to Mary's report every year. Mary is probably the best analyst around what's happening around connectivity in the digital market. She does this phenomenal report talking all about each of the regions and what's happening. The thing she tracks every year for the last 15 years is she tracks what's happened to the major indices of the most successful companies. And the maths is really interesting. What she'll tell you is that for the longest time, because you needed capital and because you needed time to get to critical mass, is the average time it took a company to come to the Fortune 500 was about 75 years. That was about 20 years ago. Next year, Mary thinks the average time it will take a new entrant to come to the Fortune 500 is 8 years, and she thinks by 2020 it will be 5. So the reason that's important is the conversation I had probably for the last 10 or 15 years with most boards was, but it's not good shareholder value to invest in something that won't happen quickly. And they're right. You wouldn't take your capital, you wouldn't take your focus, you wouldn't take your bandwidth and invest in things that may or may not work in 10 or 15 years' time. Some companies do that. Some companies are truly only innovation companies and their shareholders want them to invest in that space and they don't mind taking big risks on big bets. But most of us in the room, the companies we work for, and ourselves included at EY, if we think about our partnership, most of us in the room, we live in a very different world. Our shareholders want a consistent, steady return. The challenge now is if businesses are going to arise and challenge you and disrupt the model inside of 5 or 10 years, then you do have to be thinking about the space. It is on your watch, and you do have to balance your investment. Now, it depends who your investor is, of course. Many investors would say, we're perfectly happy just to be as profitable as we can for as long as we can with the current asset. But if you want to balance profitability and sustainability in your business, you have to have a dual track. So more and more boards and CFOs are talking to me about this. They're saying, how do I manage that? How do I make it work inside my existing organization? If I go and ask my existing organization, who is driven to be as lean and as effective and as productive as they can be, and I ask them to innovate, that just breaks. That won't work. And they're right. So you need, we think, to have a dual track. You need to make a sensible investment into new business models. You need to trial and learn and understand how they work. And you need to be very clear with your board and your shareholders around how much you're investing in that. And how much is enough and how much is not enough? Nothing is clearly not enough. Everything is too much. But we'll share some thoughts on what we think the answer is in between. And I come back to the reason it's most important is, I go to loads of events where people talk about amazing new technology companies, digital companies. There is one correlation you'll find. The correlation you'll find is that the companies that have been really successful beyond pre-money, beyond early stage, the companies that have kind of got out of their IPO and proven a path to profitability for shareholders, they're efficient with capital. That's the common thing on this list. They're efficient around finding a business model that means they don't have to invest where other people have had to invest in capital. So I won't go through them all, but Airbnb will be the largest accommodation provider in the world soon without owning a single room or owning a single hotel. They will never worry about managing their assets because they have none. They've pulled the clever trick of managing to run a balance sheet which looks very different to every other large-scale accommodation provider in the world. We've talked about Uber, that the same is true for the other companies here. For the broadcasters in the room, incredibly challenging times, probably one of the first industries to come under threat from this. The infrastructure required for a traditional terrestrial broadcaster is what made it so difficult, right? Yes, the advertising model changed, but they're still inventory owners. It's still incredibly compelling to own one of our national broadcasters and to be able to put that content out to air. What's more challenging now is that you can broadcast high-quality, high-def content from your living room with a $39 broadband connection. Now, the broadcasters in the room will tell me I'm incredibly wrong. My good friends, all of them will say that there's all sorts of things that still need to be done. But what these companies do that's clever is they bypass that heavy capital requirement, and many times they bypass the requirement to be gold standard. So that's the other thing, if you look through the commonality here, is, they will challenge privacy regulation. And I have a saying that I'm fond of, which is to say, prosumer will win. So here's the other conversation. I'll explain what that means. But here's the other conversation I have with most boards. After boards talk to me to say, let's talk about the risk to shareholders of over-investing in a model that's not proven. The next thing that normally happens is the CFO will get a delegation from the business to say, here are 10,000 reasons why it can't happen. Here are a bunch of regulatory or policy reasons that will mean it won't be allowed. Here's why we've talked to government or to awareness groups or to customer groups. Here are the concerns around what the new model would mean. Again, 10 or 20 years ago, probably the right approach to risk. Think carefully before entering a new market because of the regulatory hurdle. All of these businesses, if you went through them one by one, all of them will have had a moment where the market would have said, impossible. You can't do that. No one will let you. Prosumer wins. If it's the right thing for a user, if customers say that makes it easier, faster, better, eventually they win. That's the thing we've learned more than anything in the last 5 years of this kind of digital revolution. The huge debate and furor over Uber stems, of course, from regulation which is driven not by the customer, but driven by the provider. Now, yes, there's safety issues. Yes, there's privacy issues. Yes, you should think really carefully as a CFO and a CEO and a board about whether your brand is going to be the brand that's going to be first. But once you see these models start to fall over, it becomes very clear. If it works for the customer, regulation will catch up. And regulation's catching up far faster now. So, it's astonishing to me how many jurisdictions are enabling autonomous vehicles or are enabling Uber, pushing past that. Will it be easy for them? No. They've got deep pockets to fight those fights. But in the same way that thinking about the technology won't change, I think for you as a CFO, you need to take a different view in terms of risk. So when people come to you and say it can't happen because of regulatory or industry compliance issues, be careful to say, okay, that won't happen. All of these examples are examples where that change is happening far faster. So for us at EY, and there's always a plug, right, in every presentation, but for us at EY, the key message is we don't think digital is a technology problem. If someone comes to you and says, let me build you a website, you need to get a new perspective on digital. The real perspective on digital, it touches every part of your business. It touches compliance, regulatory, legal. It touches supply chain and operations. Arguably, the biggest impact to your balance sheet and your shareholders is in the back office rather than the front. So many customers come to me and say, I've spent tens of millions of dollars on my front-end customer experience, but I'm not seeing the profit. You need to digitize end-to-end if you're going to invoke the new business model. And the real value in the early days of your digital journey are far more in the back office and managing supply chain, cost of operations, manufacturing and production. Yes, it's table stakes now to have a brilliant, beautiful website and mobile application, but if that's the only place you're spending money, then all you're doing is keeping up. Effectiveness and profitability will come from the rest of the business. So our view is you need to be able to traverse all of that. Now, I'll ask a couple of questions as we go, but this is interesting, a survey that we did, a global survey that we're doing as part of our CFO research, is despite all of that, the most common conversation I have is with CFOs is, I know it's changing, I'm very, very worried about the rate of change, but is it a high priority for me right now? No. Half of our CFOs. Now actually, if you'd done the survey 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been much lower. I think people were much more skeptical about the rate of change. My general sense now is people accept the rate of change. The reason they say no, it's not a top priority, is because there's so much else to do. So that's my take on this, and I've talked to a bunch of people that we interviewed through this process. You know, the perspective is not, is it strategically important? It's, I can't make it a priority because other things in my business are still a priority. Driving shareholder return out of the current business is my top priority. And I think what we are finding, though, is that the other theme that comes through from CFOs is they're saying, I'm being asked to do more and more in this space now. Increasingly, I'm being asked to think about investments that historically might have been the purvey of other parts of the executive. So you've always been responsible for the total balance sheet, but strategically being responsible for investment around innovation and technology. More and more CFOs I talk to are now being asked, can you help us justify the return? So that, I think, is a real change in the last few years in the discussion. And the reason it's a change is because you're all spending a lot more on this. So it varies by industry, absolutely, but anyone who has a forward-facing customer or retail manufacturing business, the conversation I have with most of you is every year my spend on digital goes up, whether it's digital marketing, whether it's investing in my front-end customer, technology, website, social, mobile, whether it's trying to integrate the value chain a little bit more so we're more digitized, so we can deliver against that digital expectation. Those costs have gone from millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions, depending on who you all are in the room. And increasingly, the question becomes attribution. How do I know what that money got spent on? Was it spent wisely, and did it generate a return? I have a view that there's actually quite a new, fundamentally different economic happening now around spend at the front of the business. And most of the boards I talk to are unfamiliar with it. So there was some great research in the AFR in Australia a couple of months ago. They did a survey and they estimated that around 3% of board members they would describe as having any kind of digital background or being aware of the new digital economic. And what I mean by that is, we're all familiar with and have good history, governance and control over traditional technology spend. So everyone in the room knows what it means to deploy a mainframe or a client-server technology project. We're familiar with the risks, we have good controls around that. We're familiar with traditional advertising to acquire customers and traditional channels. So you'll all have your own formula to say what is a shop or a store or an advertising campaign, what does that mean in terms of the way it flows through to profitability? The economics of digital look very different, and that's the challenge most boards are asking me about. That's why the AFR measures that at 3%, because if you go to the average board member today, to one of your most important stakeholder groups, and say, where did that digital money go when I ran a Facebook campaign? How did that work? Explain to me how I bought it, explain to me what I paid for it, explain to me whether it was benchmarked as a fair and reasonable cost, explain to me how many customers we acquired, and explain to me what profit we made from that interaction with the customer. That looks very different to print and television media spending. So increasingly at the front end, I have the CMO and the CFO asking me all the time, how can we make that more transparent and educate our board around the need to spend more there? Logically, people understand that you need to engage online. So logically, boards know that you need to touch your customer in the new digital world, but they're still nervous about whether that money is being used effectively. And the industry is relatively new. There's a lot of high-profile press at the moment in Australia, for example, around just the efficacy of that spend. When an agency says to you, we spent $10 million on X in the digital world, is that exactly where it went? The problem is the technology is changing and it's quite a federated landscape, so it's hard to measure all that. But for a CFO now, these are becoming the basic questions you must be able to answer in a board meeting. Increasingly, these are the questions you'll be needing to be able to be confident to have your team work through with the marketing team and the sales team. You know, were we effective in our digital campaign? Did we spend money in the right places? And as I say, that's just the front. Working through the back end, it's the same discussion around logistics, supply chain, as we introduce new technologies there. Can you hand on heart say that all of your depots, waypoints, and distribution centres are more effective today in the New Zealand logistics economy than a roboticized warehouse? So some of us don't have the scale to look to deploy it. For those that do, it will absolutely be happening in the next 3 to 5 years that you'll find you'll get massive cost efficiency out of robotics and machine learning in the supply chain. Already happening for all of our major logistics and manufacturing clients throughout Asia. The shift actually even from the notion of a centralized distribution model of a supply chain where you go bring things to a place and then deliver them out, already changing all across Asia. You know, DHL and FedEx will tell you they don't aggregate their supply chain. Goods from manufactured to the door, personalized delivery, that's the new model that they're trying to crack in terms of through Asia. Now, different economy, different distribution channel, different problem, but technology is what's changing that. It's making it possible. I guess the other question is, this is a two-sided conversation. So increasingly when I talk to CFOs, the conversation's not just, how do I make sure I have all the risk and governance around cost? Increasingly you're being asked to say, what's our strategy to grow? What's our Uber strategy? If I had $1 for every time a board said to me, is Google going to replace us? You know, the answer is probably no. Never say never. The answer is probably no, but increasingly you're all being asked with the CEO to say, how will we use technology to differentiate or to change our position in the market? A number of high-profile companies have come out, insurers, banks, healthcare providers, in the last 12 to 18 months, saying we view that we are no longer companies in this industry, we view we're technology companies. I think we're all still trying to figure out what that means. The reality is for shareholders, they want them to continue to be insurers, banks, healthcare companies, because they're quite profitable industries. The challenge the CEO and the CFO are acknowledging is if that's all we did for the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be disrupted by a whole bunch of new providers that think differently about these capital issues. So growth, I think, tends to be the top of the other conversation. And I've talked a bit about supply chain. The other conversation you would obviously expect me to talk about at EY is there's tax implication to this. You know, I think not just is there balance sheet efficiency around capital, there are potentially massive savings to be had around tax, around organising yourselves in the right constructs around digital. So not just around the upfront asset investment, but thinking about how efficient you can be in terms of where those providers are based and where they come from. That world is changing really quickly. It's way above my pay grade to talk about tax, and I can see the EY tax partners looking nervous as I even go there, so I won't. But again, I mean, I can tell you that many of our largest clients who operate in an export world, so for some of us based solely in New Zealand, for the companies I work with that are targeting the New Zealand market, maybe not as relevant to discussion. If you're an exporter, that landscape will look materially different as jurisdictions sort themselves out around what they're going to do with digital providers. You know, we all watch the debate with interest around what happens to Google, Amazon, Facebook, and to the way they're classified as service providers. But you need to have a perspective on that as part of your overall tech strategy. So digital is not just disrupting capital and assets, but also the operating model in terms of your efficiency across the balance sheet. So what do you do? It sounds like there's lots of change coming. It sounds like people are asking different and difficult questions. The conversation we're having, I guess, in many of our largest clients is about this 2 paces of investment. So you can't just continue to run the old business model. You have to think about the new. But you should have a strategy around how much you invest in the new. So I talk about a portfolio of innovation, which sounds horribly digital, doesn't it? But the idea is to say that most good companies now in this space acknowledge you should still spend 70 to 80% of your investment, capital and OPEX, into the traditional business. That's managing shareholder return. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So at the left, I think on the screen, we talk about saying, measure that. If you're not measuring that, that's the first risk that you need to control as a CFO. Measure that for every dollar of technology or innovation spend, that 70% is being effectively used in the current business. And you're all very good at that. You're the best we have in the country, and that's the governance and risk model that you've built. The new piece is to say, we generally say around 20%. It kind of varies depending on what you think best practice is, sector by sector. But generally we say build 20% into what we call adjacent business models. So business models that can make money is the easy way to think about it. Pick a business or a partnership which is driven in a totally different way, which has these digital attributes, which is partner-led, built with an ecosystem of other providers, low in capital investment, disrupts your customer interaction or channel, but has a model where you could see it making money right now. When we say adjacent, it's not necessarily about how close it is to your core business. You will decide that in your strategy. What's most important is it's adjacent to the balance sheet. You can actually see a return for shareholders. Now, the return typically will be a lot lower because it's a new model and it takes time to bed in. The final 10%, and I think this is the hardest, is we recommend anywhere between sort of 7 to 10%, seems to be sort of emerging best practice with our big multinational clients, is to try something very different with a view to your end strategy. So go find a partner who's not adjacent, where it's not clear, and go invest some level of technology and innovation spend there. The reason I think that's so important now is that as a shareholder in lots of technology companies myself and in mature institutions, I expect the board to be managing some level of innovation. I don't expect the board to come back and say, we're Kodak and we forgot. We forgot to pay attention, we watched all these new technologies emerge, but it was too hard to fit that into our existing business, so we didn't invest in it. That I think you will find more and more directors under pressure, and you as CFOs being asked to guide them through that, to say we expect some level of investment and strategy around how you're managing this disruption. You've seen it probably most quickly in financial services. So all the banks and insurers started with a fintech strategy. So let's invest and get into all these kind of early stage, small cap, pre-money technology players around, whether it's peer-to-peer or blockchain or whatever it was. The reason their boards gave them money to do that was just to understand. My take on that is that most of the big four banks are here, most of the large global insurers, that was just to get their head around what was happening in the ecosystem. Start a fund, do some fintech, figure out what's going on. Now what they're doing is they're saying, now we want to actually launch businesses with some of these technologies or with new digital companies. And those new businesses, they're quite happy that they will fail, that they may not be as profitable, that they will look very different. But that is the board's way of controlling and understanding what's happening around this two paces of the business. So if you don't have a strategy laid out around that investment, as a CFO, it's about managing that spend. 70, 20, 10. What I hear time and time again from all of you when we sit down and chat about your individual business is I hear, we're just too busy. And the second thing I hear is, we don't know how to do this outside of our current model. And I think that's the big governance and risk change. Sorry, so obviously there's some progression through there. The really difficult part here is this last piece, the kind of the innovation piece. It won't work with your current executives in their current business. You can't go ask the same people that run sales or operations, who are making profit for your shareholders every day, who you are encouraging to be as effective and efficient as they can be, to then think in a completely different way. It just doesn't work. You have to give some thought to putting a space and a governance around how you set up this level of investment and disruption. And one of the characteristics, I won't go through all this, and there's lots of helpful animation. One of the characteristics of this change is that you can't do it on your own. So increasingly the success of digital models is being able to team or peer or venture with other players. More and more what I'm challenging all of you to think about is to say, why would you build your own digital capability? Take a really simple example like just running analytics and acquiring customers. Why would you think that you could be the best in the world at doing that? If you're a manufacturer, 20 years ago, would you have thought about running a logistics company? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes vertical integration makes sense. For most of us, no. I'll go and find the best provider I can. So, for example, we're talking to some of the biggest banks in the region, and again, this may be a problem statement different in Asia, to say, do I really want to have social capability in every country in Asia? Do I really want to be able to understand WeChat as well as Facebook, as well as WhatsApp, as well as every other technology platform the marketing team says I need to invest in? Or should I just go find a world-class provider to do that? The world-class provider in digital doesn't look like your old provider. So for those banks, the world-class provider looks like a Chinese internet company, or it looks like a global social media company. It doesn't look like the advertising agency of old. So I think one of the tricks for you as a CFO is to make sure there's governance around that. You don't need to know the answer, but you need to be pushing and challenging the organization to say, in this new investment, can we really do it ourselves, or should we be going and finding true digital partners that we can do that with? And then I think a final comment. I talk about this new digital economic. I think there is a set of metrics that increasingly will be demanded at the board, not just by directors to be able to run the business, but by your shareholders to be able to be sure that you're thinking beyond today's business. And I won't go through them all, but they impact all parts of your business, everything from brand and social media and the way you're perceived. I mean, as an independent director myself, I find it difficult to imagine you could come to a board meeting and be unaware that you had been attacked, with a cyber threat, or that you had had a massive social, reaction in terms of social media had said negative things about you. And if that impacts share price, I think increasingly you'll see that will start to become part of board governance. It's not about having the best cyber defense in the world, but it's like it's always been, it's about having a risk and governance strategy for it. So did we at least have a process, a program, governance around those issues? And it goes all the way through from front-end customer experience, through the supply chain, and into, sort of your risk and your balance sheet controls. One of the comments I get from all of you now a lot is, given that 3% of directors understand this, given that lots of it's new for us, how are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to manage all of these difficult new concepts and issues that are changing in line with our traditional governance? And so more and more boards are starting to place specific digital advisors into their board, if not as board members. There's an announcement just last week. So Miley Carnegie's just been appointed to the board of ANZ Bank under another great Kiwi, Shane up there as CEO. Shane's acknowledged that. Shane said, it's so important, I need to have someone who's native to this whole world. Miley, has run Procter & Gamble, and she ran a multi-billion-dollar Google business in Australia. She's now on the board of ANZ Bank. Hard to imagine that an advertiser, in the old speak, would sit in one of the key seats on the board. And increasingly for all of you in the room, without talking about you individually, I know more and more of you are thinking about either digital committees or digital advisors. Having someone like that in the board, not just to help to understand cost and governance, but to challenge and stress growth, I think that again is becoming table stakes for most savvy investors to think about companies. And so you've certainly seen that already on the West Coast, and again I think it'll kind of come down into Asia. I suspect I'm horribly over time. I'm getting a nod, I am horribly over time. So I think that's it. My last thought really is to say, the technology, as I said at the beginning, is almost academic. Just assume it will change. Just assume it will get better and better, faster and faster. The only way to deal with that level or pace of change is to manage it in the context of risk and governance. So I think, for me, the biggest challenge for the CFO now is not, what's the answer? We'll never know. We won't know what the technology solution is. The answer is, do I have a blended approach? Am I managing these two streams within my business? Am I managing profitability of the business today and having sensible discussion and investment into the business of tomorrow? The single biggest risk to most businesses now is to invest nothing or to have no governance and control around that. I think it's a really fascinating, interesting time for all of you in that space. And for the most part, it's the issue that we've all dealt with previously. So the good news is it's no different. to the launch of mainframes. It's no different to the launch of client server. It's no different to the first iteration of digital, to everything, 10 years ago. All that's happening now is that the changes are getting bigger and the impact on your balance sheet is stronger because there are competitors coming who don't need to make the same investments you would have made. But with good governance and good risk control, it's easily managed. I'm going to stop there. I think my time's up. So.